Until 1689, Native Americans were the primary threat confronting the colonists, as illustrated by this 1622 massacre at Jamestown settlements. 347 people, 1/4 of the English population of Jamestown and all its corollary settlements. This was done, of course, by the warriors of the Powhatan Confederation. This incident began 10 years of warfare called the First Tidewater War, because the eastern part of Virginia, where there are tidal estuaries, is called the Tidewater region. That's what it is. So there's 10 years of warfare in that part of Virginia, followed by a short interim of peace, and then a second Tidewater War in 1644 and 1646, in which the Virginians this time destroyed the Powhatan Confederation for good. Now, this warfare between colonists and Native Americans anticipated certain racist or ethnocentric patterns in American war making in general. There was an assumption of European or Anglo-American cultural superiority, coupled with a dehumanizing of the Native Americans, but also against other non-white cultures over time, Mexicans, Filipinos, Japanese, and particularly African Americans, against whom whites waged an unremitting war to keep them in their place, quote unquote, albeit often by means that did not resemble war as we commonly understand it. But there was also a major difference between the way that white colonists viewed African Americans and the way they viewed Native Americans. Now, the origins of white racism against African Americans remains a matter of debate. Historians are still exploring where that exactly comes from. But what is clear is that by the end of the 17th century, whites connected blacks with a specific set of traits that suggested the permanent inferiority of blacks. And this in turn justified the institution of chattel slavery. And by chattel slavery, I mean a form of slavery in which the enslaved person was legally considered to be property, more or less like livestock. Initially, however, this white racism did not necessarily involve racism in the sense of hatred. That's the way we ordinarily think of racism, but it doesn't have to be that way, and it wasn't this way during the colonial period. During the colonial period, 18th century, for example, we see instances of whites and blacks worshiping alongside one another, attending festivals together, and during the War for American Independence, even shedding blood together. But this toleration did not extend to the point of believing that whites and African Americans could live as equals. Furthermore, it did not extend to the point of believing that the white and black races should intermingle. They could, and they did, but almost exclusively by a single means: the rape of African and African American women by white men. And the color line remained in place by dint of the fact that anyone with even a small quantum of African heritage was deemed African American, or more precisely Negro, which remained the polite term for African Americans until the mid-20th century. Now, clearly, whites during the colonial era could and did organize the world in terms of race. Yet during the colonial era, they did not see Native Americans as a distinct race, but rather as savages, in more or less the same way that the ancient Romans regarded the Germanic tribes beyond the Roman frontier as savages. And The Romans and the Germanic peoples did intermingle, but in a specific way. Germanic peoples became Romanized. And as long as they behaved as Romans, they could sometimes rise to high status within Roman society. Some people of Germanic backgrounds even became Roman generals. One came pretty close to becoming a Roman emperor. Now, there was a long-standing assumption that Indians could, should, and eventually would embrace European civilization. And the vision that whites had of the Native American future was one of assimilation, of the cultural disappearance of Native Americans, but not the literal disappearance of Native Americans. And in the late 1800s, a well-intentioned US officer named Richard Henry Pratt created the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which incidentally is nowadays the site of the US Army War College. And the Army brought hundreds of Native American boys to the school to be educated as whites on the theory that, as Pratt expressed it, one must kill the Indian to save the man. And this photograph, which you've probably been looking at, like, what the hell is it for a while? On the left, you see these Native American boys who've been dressed up, in what passed for Native garb. This is all a posed set of photographs. And then on the right, you see them wearing Anglo clothing and adopting Anglo poses and having Anglo hair and educated in an Anglo manner. This is the future that even colonial whites anticipated for Native Americans. The Puritans, for example, sent missionaries to convert Native Americans and organize them into so-called praying towns and accepted them as brethren in Christ up to a point. As with the Romans, the acceptance was always predicated on conformity to the ways of the Puritans. And somehow Native American Christians could never quite conform enough. The major problem, however, was that some Native Americans failed to conform at all and defended their lands and their way of life, and their manner of defense was, in European eyes, savage, and demanded a savage response. And the relevant English conception of war against savages is illustrated by their conduct in Ireland during the 16th and 17th centuries. And you're looking at an engraving of one of those rebellions that the English put down, this one, particular one in 1569. And the way in which Englishmen made war against the Irish is strikingly similar to the way they made war against the Native Americans. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the story of Ireland. In theory, Ireland had belonged to English kings by right of conquest since the Normans not only occupied England across the Channel in 1066, took over England, but they also went over to Ireland and took over Ireland as well. And in succeeding centuries, the Irish reoccupied much of their island, but in English eyes, never established legal title over it. And despite the Catholicism of the Irish, Englishmen considered the Irish to be essentially pagan. The Celtic form of Catholicism that they practiced, just a thin veneer for older, darker, pagan beliefs. And it was important for the English to convince themselves that the Irish were pagans, because if they were Catholic, they were Christian, which in turn meant they must be civilized. And although the English admitted that pagan people might be civilized, for example, the Romans, it was not hard for them to satisfy themselves that the primitive Irish were really barbarians, and barbarians of a culpable sort, since they had been exposed to Christianity, but had supposedly rejected the benefits of Christianity despite this thin veneer of observance. People believe pretty much what they need to believe. And so the wars against the Irish then were considered as wars against barbarians. And the object of the Irish Wars was to drive the native Irish beyond an expanding zone called the Pale of Settlement, inhabited by English colonists around Dublin. Now, the method was terror. This is a close-up of the same engraving that I just showed you. Here you can see what's really going on. If you notice, two English soldiers are carrying swords, and on the at the tips of their swords are the impaled heads of two Irish rebels. And then the English soldier on the right has a musket in one hand and the severed head of another Irish rebel in the other. And the man in charge of all of this was a fellow named Sir Humphrey Gilbert. And in October 1569, he undertook to pacify, quote unquote, the Irish near the town of Munster. And when resistance materialized, which of course it did, he made war against, I'm quoting here, man, woman, and child, so that the name of an Englishman was made more terrible to them than the sight of 100 was before. And the name of that Englishman was Sir Humphrey Gilbert. And Gilbert's most memorable act was to line the path to his tent with the heads of slain Irishmen. And when defeated rebels came to him to beg for mercy, they were forced to approach Gilbert along this path. And as one observer wrote, this technique brought, quote, great terror to the people when they saw the heads of their dead fathers, brothers, children, kinsfolk, and friends lie on the ground before their faces as they came to speak with Colonel Gilbert. Now, it is not difficult to see how this style of warfare, first adopted in Ireland, transplanted itself to the American colonies. First, English colonists fought not to conquer and assimilate the American Indians as the Spanish had done, Mexico, South America, but to drive them beyond their own pale of settlement. So we're not talking about immediate assimilation. That's a kind of a cultural construct that some colonists, followed. But when it came to wartime, the idea was to push them away. Second, the English regarded themselves as civilized and the Indians as barbarians with no legal right to the land. Now, sometimes the English generously condescended to pay for some land anyway, and except in wartime, the sites of Native American villages were considered to belong to the Native American that lived there, but in wartime, all bets were off. Third, the English were not reluctant to make war upon women and children as well as warriors on the theory that the Indians were savages and could be subdued in no other way. And finally, the initial view of the Indians was similar to the English view of the Irish. That is to say, Europeans did not see them as being inferior by nature. On the contrary, Europeans tended to view Native Americans as magnificent physical specimens and also believed that their darker hue was the consequence of exposure to sun or to deliberate staining of the skin. Africans' darker skin was attributed to the fact that they were Africans. Native Americans, in effect, were kind of seen as resembling Europeans, but just Europeans who had been out in the sun for a long time or had dyed their skin and so on. Okay. So there is a sense, a strange kind of a sense of a closer cultural connection potentially with Native Americans than with Africans and African Americans. So if we're not dealing with racial inferiority, then what are we dealing with from an English point of view? Well, the primitiveness of the Native Americans was attributed to nurture, not nature, but nurture. The Indians had, in effect, chosen this savage way of life, just as the Irish had chosen their pagan ways.